I'm Sharon DeBartolo Carmack. Today my guest may be very familiar to you. If you've watched some old Disney movies or unsolved mysteries, you may recognize him. He is an actor, a professional genealogist, and the author of Psychic Roots, Hank Jones. Welcome, Hank. I'm glad you could join us.
Thank you, Sharon. Good to be here.
You know, I have always been interested in the paranormal. Do you remember back in the late 60s a daytime soap opera called Dark Shadows?
Oh, boy, do I ever.
I loved that show.
Yeah, spooky.
It was very spooky. And in fact, that was a show that got me interested in genealogy in the past and going to cemeteries and that sort of thing. And so when your book came out, Psychic Roots, it was on my shelf immediately. I was very interested in that. How did it come about?
Well, you know, I've been doing genealogy since I was 8 years old. My folks had a trunk in the basement of their home, and when I grew up, and my first words I ever heard about genealogy were from my mother, who said, "Hank, don't go in their trunk," which of course I did.
Naturally.
And it just blossomed from there. And as I started climbing the family tree, really unusual things started to happen over the years. And not all the time, but just once in a while. I would have dreams about some of my ancestors. And my whole thrust in my genealogy later on became tracing a group of Germans who came to America in the 18th century called the Palatines. And I didn't descend from any of them. And when I finally began the European leg of my research, I had to start someplace. I was looking for 847 families. And so my researcher over there said, "Well, Hank, we have to begin." I said, "Of course we have to begin. I want 847 families. I want to find out where they came from." And she said, "Where do we start?" She was a very firm, typical German lady. And I said, "Well, I'll tell you what, I've always been interested in Dietrich Schneider up in Hockenberg. He's one of 847. I don't care about any of them particularly. I'm not related to him, but go look for him first." So anyway, a few years later, we found many, many immigrants, probably 600 now of the 847 families.
Wow.
And the only family I'm directly related to is the Dietrich Schneider family of Hockenberg.
You're kidding.
My first choice, selected totally at random for Carla, my researcher, to look overseas. So that kind of grabbed me, and I said, "What's going on here?" And then I went back east to where some of the German settlers of the 18th century lived in New York and New Jersey. And the local historians would be taking me around, showing me the sites of the cemeteries and the churches and all the county courthouses and stuff. And in some cases, as we were driving along, I would be able to tell them what was around the bend of the road before we got there. And I'd never been there before. And, you know, this was really getting a little strange. And then I would have dreams. I'm a little reluctant to say this sometimes. As my daughter would say, "Dad's getting a little too close to that butterfly net again." But I'd have dreams sometimes about the Palatines, this special area of these Germans I was interested in. And in a couple of dreams on immigrants I had not found overseas yet, an immigrant would tell me where they were in the dream, and then I'd set my researcher in Germany to look for them in the place where the dream said they were, and we found 4 immigrants that way. And so I just got very intrigued by this whole thing that was happening to me. It was engulfing me.
Now, before this, had you had any psychic experiences?
No, not really. I don't think so. I did find out that my grandmother, though, had a psychic ability, evidently. Her specialty was playing almost a parlor game where she would have people in a parlor, they would fix upon one object, she'd be out of the room, she'd come into the room, and she could say which object it was that everybody was, you know, pre-said that they were going to think about. And she would do this with different groups. There was no plants. I mean, it was just kind of a strange thing. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to find out if it was indeed me that was just getting a little too close to the butterfly net. So I wrote to 200 of my fellow genealogists around the world, of great repute, really. And I said, "Hey, here's what's been happening to me. Has any of this ever happened to you? Some serendipitous event, some synchronistic event, some intuitive nudge that somehow led you along the way to success, but you couldn't explain it?"
Right.
And they started to come back, these responses, right away. They usually started with, "Yes, I know what you mean." And they tell me a story.
Wow.
But my favorite ones were the ones that would say, "I've never told this to anybody before." Then they'd lay one on me.
Except their therapist.
Except their therapist, exactly. And then they'd tell me an experience that happened to them. And I'm up to 1,300 now from around the world. They're still coming in. I guarantee I'll have 2 or 3 next week that'll show up. And they knock my socks off. Some of them are not Twilight Zoners. They're just very ordinary things that are quite interesting. But many, if Rod Serling were alive today, he would have put them, I think, on Twilight Zone.
Wow.
And they've just been so neat, and they're such a great reinforcement that this kind of stuff does happen if we're only open to it.
So with all these stories, how did you manage to select what was going to go in the book and what wasn't?
Well, whatever made my boat float.
Okay.
And also to get a variety. There were cemetery stories. There were microfilm stories. There were stories relating to timing. Just in Congress, things that would happen in regard that shouldn't have happened at the same time. There were things that I couldn't cubbyhole. And then there were also the feelings behind the experiences that people were sharing with me. Why was this happening? And one thing I tried to do is I had no agenda in writing this book. I mean, I wasn't trying to preach a certain gospel to say this is why this happens.
Right.
I don't know why it happens. I just know that this sort of thing happens along the way once in a while. And my feeling was just, hey, celebrate it and enjoy it and go with it.
Yeah.
Have fun with it. And they've just been collecting from then on.
Were you worried at all that your colleagues would criticize you for the, I mean, it's not exactly scholarly genealogy, and it's not something that instructors teach, this is how you do genealogy or anything. Were you concerned about what your colleagues would think?
When I decided to write a book about it, I didn't know what would happen. And I yet have to receive a negative response.
Really?
Now, I know people who don't like the whole concept, who don't give any credence to this at all, probably didn't write. But by and large, they're all reinforcements of what was going on to me and my friends.
That's great.
It's been really great. But I really always make this caveat that in no way was I minimizing, the scientific method of genealogy. I'm just saying that once in a while, something like this happened, and what's it all about, Alfie?
Right.
And usually nobody knows what it is all about, Alfie. Usually they just say it happened, and it sure helped my research.
What are some of your favorite stories from the book?
Oh, there are all kinds. One of my favorites was told to me by Reverend Schuster. I was speaking up in Michigan in 1984, and he knew I was starting to collect these stories. And he told me once, I got a story to tell you, Hank. He said, for years he'd hoped to visit the East Coast town where one of his Schuster ancestors was buried, but he was a very busy minister and he never had time to make the trip. So for like 20 or 25 years, he had longed to go back and visit the grave of his Schuster ancestor back east. Never could do it. Well, finally, some young ministerial student graduated from seminary, offered to take over his pulpit, and Reverend Schuster was able to go back east and to go to the cemetery. So he arrived. And he went there and he gulped, he said, because he looked around. It wasn't just a couple of graves. It was a cemetery that went on, hill and dale, just on and on, a huge place. And he didn't know where to begin to look for the Schuster grave. So he sought out the sexton to the cemetery, and he asked the sexton if he might happen to know where his ancestor was buried. And with that, the sexton of the cemetery led him immediately to his Schuster ancestor's grave. And Reverend Schuster says, I was amazed. And they asked the sexton, well, how could you possibly know where my ancestor was buried and you didn't have to go back to your office and look it up?
Right, yeah.
And the sexton of the cemetery informed Reverend Schuster that he was the fifth person that day to ask for that particular headstone.
You're kidding.
Yeah. And with that, the sexton pointed to a hollow on the hill overlooking the cemetery where the 25th annual Schuster family reunion was taking place.
Oh, wow.
And as Reverend Schuster told me, with the tears streaming down my face, I walked up the hill, and I met my family.
Oh, that's a cool story.
That's a great story.
That's a good one, yeah.
And another one of my favorites was told to me by Chris and Seymour Rose. They're both great genealogists. And one time Seymour Rose went to San Francisco, and Chris was doing something else, I forget what it was. And Seymour went to a used bookstore in San Francisco just to pass the time. By the way, one thing genealogists never should do, as we both know, is never take a credit card to a used bookstore.
Absolutely.
This is big trouble.
Big trouble.
So he walked in, he looked across the bookstore, and on the top shelf of a stack of books, way up high, was a book. And first book he saw. So he went over and he grabbed it. And he opened it up. And on the first page he opened it up to was a wonderfully detailed biography of his California great-great-grandfather, the Reverend Benjamin Brierley. And that was the first book he saw, the first page he opened up to. And the wild thing is, Sharon, is it was a 4-volume set, but it was the only volume of that 4-volume set for sale at the bookstore. Yeah.
That gives me goosebumps.
Yeah. Well, it gets a little better. So Chris and Seymour, about 6 months later, were cooking dinner for a genealogical pal. Chris is a great cook. And she was in the kitchen cooking dinner, and Seymour went to the closet and brought out the book that he bought at the bookstore. And first book he saw, first page he opened to, of the Reverend Benjamin Brierly's biography, his great-great-grandfather. And as he's telling their genealogical colleague the story, the lady, their guest, is fiddling with the flyleaf of the book. And she opened the flyleaf of the book, and there on the flyleaf of the book was an inscription from the author of the book to the Reverend Benjamin Brierly. Seymour Rose had bought his ancestor's own copy of that book. And as Chris and Seymour say, I think that Seymour was probably meant to have that book.
I think so too.
Yeah, and the thing is too, these experiences happen to young and old and every ethnic group, you know, very religious people, atheists. Nobody has a monopoly on this, and that's what delights me, because I kept trying to tell my friends the same thing. You know, I don't chase dead Germans, they chase me.
That's right.
And they do. They hunt you down. And it was wonderful to get the reinforcement from so many of my colleagues that it happens to them too once in a while.
So did you find that more of these experiences happen in cemeteries or libraries, or where do they happen?
All over the joint, all over. But cemeteries are a real arena for this sort of event to happen. Of course, how do you explain to a civilian, too, what we do in cemeteries? I mean, come on. My daughter, when I go out to look in cemeteries, she'll wink at her friends and say, that's my dad. You know, he's kind of a half bubble off plum. But anyway, in cemeteries, it happens a lot. My friend Nick Vine Hall has a radio talk show throughout Australia about genealogy, sort of the Larry King of Australia. And he says the most common thing people tell him on his talk show about when they go to research in a cemetery, look for their ancestors' stones, is the same story. It almost goes in sequence. I'd never been to the cemetery before. I drove into the cemetery parking lot. I got out of my car, and I walked straight to my ancestor's grave. I mean, it happens an awful lot. And then in libraries too, you know, with microfilms and all the books and whatever in a library, you know, just so many things can happen in this whole area of psychic phenomenon also. A lady named Joan Lowry in San Diego had a great story. She was looking for her ancestor Sebastian Deubel, who lived in Germany but never found him. And Joan is one of these real givers. She does wonderful things for other people, can never find her own people. And so she methodically, at the end of every workday at the library, would look for this Sebastian Deubel in various microfilms throughout various sections of Germany. Never found a thing. Well, one day she was at the microfilm reader, and she was pooped. She had a lousy day. By the way, these things happen very often when you're very fatigued.
Oh.
And that was a real commonality in some of the experiences. Anyway, and she was she was at the microfilm reader, and so she was put on a microfilm. She didn't know, just some part of Germany, again looking for Sebastian Deubel, and she just kind of twiddled the microfilm handle ahead. Maybe she said about 50 frames, and it stopped on the baptism of a Sebastian Deubel. And she said, "My gosh, this is great," but for some weird reason, she twiddled again. And she said she went ahead about 75 frames, and it stopped on the marriage of Sebastian Deubel. With that, Joan said, she looked, she said, okay, burial.
Really?
Yeah.
It happened the third time.
Yeah, and again at the library. And so many times with books, you know, you're very often a common experience is you've had, again, a lousy day of research. Nothing's happened for you. You're kind of grumbling your way out of the library, and you happen to look down at the return cart where somebody else is returning a book, and their face open on the return cart is maybe somebody you've looked for 30 years. And there they are.
Okay, I want to deviate just a little bit, because in Psychic Roots and More Psychic Roots, in the introductory material, you talk about your acting career, which I think is just fascinating. In fact, I remember going to the theater and seeing Blackbeard's Ghost.
Oh my gosh.
Yes. I don't remember you, but I remember going to the theater and seeing Blackbeard's
Right.
Ghost. Tell us a little bit about your acting career, how you got involved in
Well, I
acting.
started as a singer on RCA Victor Records, and I was in a singing team called Hank and Dean, and we got RCA Victor Records one week. The next week we got co-starring on the Tennessee Ernie Ford Show, which was on ABC all across the country 5 days a week, which was a great blessing. And it was a great education, because on the Ford Show we got to learn with the people whoever were guesting on the show. I often played Minnie Pearl's boyfriend, believe it or not, as her younger boyfriend, and with Bob Hope, and we worked with Patsy Cline just a week before she was killed in a plane crash. Just all kinds of interesting experiences. A good beginning. And then Dean was drafted, my singing partner. He went on to write That's Life for Frank Sinatra, so I don't worry about Dean anymore.
Yeah.
And anyway, Ernie Ford's agent was Fred McMurray's agent, and they put me on My Three Sons. And I played the best friend every so often of Don Grady, who played Robbie on the show. And then I just did a bunch of the sitcoms in the 60s and 70s. And when we filmed them, we thought they'd be long gone. No one would ever remember these things, gone forever, just a job. But with cable television, there's an insatiable appetite for all this product. So, every show has its own group of buffs and fans, and people will come up to me, particularly on the Disney movies, and they'll recognize me from some of the Disney movies, and they'll tell me the lines that I said in the movie, and I said, heck, I didn't know the lines when I did them. How can you know them? But I did 8 films for Disney. Blackbeard's Ghost was Walt's last movie, his own last. He died in the middle of filming. We closed the studio down. I'll never forget that.
I was in elementary school.
You were in elementary. Thanks a lot, Sharon. I needed this.
I remember they took us all into the auditorium on the day Disney died or when it came out or whatever, and we got to watch a Disney film.
Yeah.
That day. Yeah.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah.
I'm glad to hear that. He was something else. If he would get mad if you called him Mr. Disney.
Really?
Had to be Uncle Walt or Walt.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Oh.
Anyway, I did a bunch of them. Shaggy DA and Herbie Rides Again, Cat from Outer Space. They all sound alike, but they hold up. And on the sitcoms, I did I did a lot of Patty Duke shows and Love Boats and Family Affairs and I did the pilot episode of Mork and Mindy with Robin Williams, and I should have a T-shirt that says I survived Robin Williams.
I bet.
He was along with Peter Ustinov and Blackbeard. He's the only other genius I've ever worked with. He's a remarkable man. So it was a good background. But then about 1985, I did a lot of commercials, lots of commercials. I was known as the guy with a no-look look. The guy, looks like the guy down the street. But I also never got the girl. And I always played a nebbish or a wimp. Didn't like that. So in 1985, I had just done a lecture at the National Genealogical Society conference in Salt Lake City, because this is always, genealogy was my hobby since I was 8.
Right.
And really was my therapy in between pictures, waiting for the phone to ring. Of course, as some of my friends would say, the therapy didn't work, did it? But anyway, I did this lecture at Salt Lake City and came back to my home in LA at the time. And there was only one message on my answering machine. And the thing in Salt Lake went very well. I mean, it was a nice conference, a big audience. I felt I contributed a lot. But anyway, on my answering machine, there was only one message, and it says, for my commercials agent. And he said, "Can you be a dancing chicken at 3 o'clock?"
Oh, no.
And I said, "No, wait a minute, Hank Jones. Maybe it's time to move on." So as much as I would have liked the residuals that the dancing chicken would have laid,
I'm sure.
I decided to go into Dead People.
Yes.
And here I am.
Now, but don't you still make CDs? Aren't you still
I still
singing?
sing, yeah. That's the one thing about the entertainment business I miss, and I still do. On RCA, they never let us record all the songs we wanted to record. And so I had a list for 40 years of songs I wanted to record, and I have, and put it out on a smaller label. Now it's getting some nice airplay around the country. A friend of mine said he was listening to an easy music station back in Baltimore the other day, and the announcer said, "And now we've just heard from Frank Sinatra and Peggy Lee, and now here's Hank Jones." I said, "My God, that's
Isn't
great."
that cool?
It was fun.
So where can we get your CD?
They're available via my website and through Epitome Records.
And your website is?
www.hankjones.com.
Well, that's easy enough to remember. Now, getting back to Psychic Roots, is there going to be an even more Psychic Roots, or?
No, I did Psychic Roots, More Psychic Roots, and I wanted to call More Psychic Roots, by the way, Bride of Psychic Roots or Son of Psychic Roots, but they wouldn't let me do it, the publisher. No, I've really said pretty much what I want to say about it. I don't want to write a book that's kind of padded. You read books sometimes that say, why did this guy write this book? Mm-hmm. And what I do on the news stories that come in is I use them in my talks and my seminars around the country, which I do a lot. Okay. And so they're always fresh and they just seem to top one another in regard to knocking people's socks off.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
When someone reads your book, what do you hope they walk away with?
I hope they walk away with kind of an openness towards this whole area, that something beyond what we can see and touch is there. And again, I purposely don't say why it is. I don't know why this happens. It happens. But it happens in all aspects of our life, and I think we cannot lose so long as we pay attention to it. I also, some of the things that came in from our genealogist friends were really so reaffirming. We're in the legacy business. We are not writing for ourselves. We are not doing research for just us. We are.
Right.
But we're doing it for the people who came after us, and we're doing it for our ancestors. They want to be remembered. I'm writing a book now about my great-grandfather, Isaac Hillman, who came to California in the gold rush, who was a real character. He didn't go to the mining fields. He went to San Francisco and opened a temperance hotel where no liquor was ever served. Of course, in another corner of that trunk when I was a kid, I pulled out a book and I blew off the dust and I read it, and it said, Hillman's Patent Medicines. And he had a recipe for Hillman's Cure-All, which had 10 gallons of pure grain alcohol, cayenne pepper, and then it said you add prodigious amounts of opium.
Oh my gosh.
And you brew it. And my dad remembered taking that stuff as a kid, and he said, after that, I didn't remember a thing.
I don't doubt it. I don't doubt it.
But one of the things that came to me through the Psychic Roots books was the fact that our ancestors want to be remembered. And in writing a book about my own family, this Isaac Hillman and everybody, I pulled out an old daguerreotype, an old, if you've ever seen in the frames with a reflected image, of my great-great aunt, who was Isaac Hillman's sister, Elizabeth Hillman. And she had died in 1852 in a steamboat race on the Hudson River. Two big steamships were barreling along the Hudson, and one of the boilers blew up and blew up both ships. And the choice came for my Aunt Elizabeth to get in the lifeboat, but there was only room for one person. And there was a younger woman there in her 20s, and my great-great-aunt said, no, I've lived a life, you get in that lifeboat. And she did, and she was saved, and my great-great-aunt went down with the ship. And I'd seen this old daguerreotype, 25 times. I pulled it out last year, and I looked at it, and I started to get all teared up because I said, my God, I'm the only one that remembers this person. What a responsibility.
Right.
And so I think it is our job, if that's the word, to write it down about all of our ancestors and all of the people that interacted with them, and make them last.
Definitely.
Make them last. And so that's what I've been trying to do, and that's what you do. That's what we all try to do.
Absolutely. It's
a great feeling. I think someone said from a metaphysical point of view, what the heck are we dealing with dead people? Why do we do this? What's going on here?
Right.
And the reason that came back from a lot of people was, you know why we do it? It's because we do it. And more than that, it's what we're supposed to do. So we do it. And what we try to do too, I think, is you got to put, first of all, you got a skeleton of names and dates. But again, it's part of our job to put flesh and blood on the skeleton of names and dates and make them come alive. And so you get your diaries and your pictures and your journals and anything that makes these people three-dimensional.
Right.
And that's who they were. They're people. And that's what the kick is. And of course, it's more fun too to, it's great to have an ancestor who fought in the Revolution or came on the Mayflower, but for gosh sakes, you got to honor the horse thief too.
Absolutely.
They're more fun.
They are more fun. Well, Hank, it's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Oh, Sharon, I've enjoyed it.
I'm so glad you were able to come and share some stories with us.
Thank
you very much.
And keep up the good work.
You too.
Thanks.
Thanks.